Monica Drake had never expected that inheriting her late aunt's hillside property would draw her into the kind of conflict that could devour entire years of a person's life, because for her, the place represented something entirely different. A chance to breathe, to step out of the suffocating rhythm of the city, and find a silence that was not empty, but layered with the steady pulse of the earth, the rustling of tall grasses on the slope, and the distant sound of water against the rocks of the lake. The house itself was modest, a wooden structure with broad windows and a terrace that faced west, and Monica quickly grew attached to the rhythm of watching the sky turn molten every evening, a daily ritual she began to treasure with almost obsessive intensity. After long days spent lecturing at the small liberal arts college where she taught philosophy, she would return home, leave her notes on the desk without rereading them, pour a glass of wine, and stand by the terrace railing while the sky lowered itself into tones of amber and violet, a simple event that held her attention more securely than any lecture she had ever delivered. The neighborhood into which she had moved was deceptively quiet, not unfriendly but guarded, the kind of community where conversations rarely went beyond polite greetings and where property lines mattered more than introductions. Monica, who had always been somewhat self-contained, did not mind this arrangement. She was not looking for friends or allies, only for the continuation of a private life that revolved around books, quiet music, and the long horizon of the evening sky. For the first months, everything remained undisturbed, and she told herself she had made the right choice, that the house would become not only a home, but a sanctuary, a place where the memory of her aunt's life would continue without interruption. That illusion began to fracture in subtle increments, almost imperceptible at first. One morning, walking down the slope to check the mail, she noticed trucks parked on the neighboring lot, men unloading steel beams and lumber with the kind of loud determination that belonged to industrial projects rather than residential ones. She assumed, with mild curiosity but little concern, that someone had purchased the land and was planning to build a house. She even considered it might bring a measure of companionship to the lonely hillside. The days that followed, however, brought an unsettling escalation. Foundations poured at unnatural speed, walls rising in weeks, windows fitted before she had even grown accustomed to the sound of hammers. By midsummer, a 2-story skeleton had become a massive shell, then a fully dressed mansion with sharp angles and glass panels that caught the sun like a knife. Monica tried not to resent it, reminding herself that development was inevitable, that land was bought and used according to rights, and that envy or nostalgia had no place in the practical world. Yet, the first evening she realized the sun had disappeared not behind the horizon, but behind the wall of the new house. She felt something inside her recoil as if a piece of her life had been quietly taken. The sky still changed colors, but the progression was hidden, fractured into odd shadows across her lawn, and she found herself staring not at an open landscape, but at the reflective surface of tinted windows that now dominated the western view. It was a theft, not of property but of time, of ritual, of the delicate bond she had formed with the setting of each day. She could have accepted it, perhaps, if the neighbor had introduced himself, explained, offered a word of recognition or apology, but there was only silence from across the fence. His name, she later learned, was Jason Manners, a developer whose reputation in the county carried equal measures of admiration and resentment, a man who bought land, built quickly, and moved on to the next project with little concern for the fabric of the community left behind. For Monica, the mansion became less a house than an intruder, a physical presence that pressed into her life without acknowledgement, and each evening she stood on the terrace she felt a growing tension between the privacy she had sought and the intrusion she could not ignore. The turning point arrived with a letter, delivered not by Jason himself but by a courier in a neat envelope embossed with the crest of a law firm. It spoke in precise, almost clinical language of interference with natural light, of trees obstructing the lawful enjoyment of property, and of the possibility of legal remedies should she fail to address the situation. At first, Monica laughed at the absurdity, the notion that her oaks and maples, standing for decades before Jason ever appeared, were now an obstacle. But as she read the letter again, noticing the date that curiously preceded the completion of the mansion, her laughter faded into a chill realization. This was not a misunderstanding, but a calculated move, prepared even before the house had risen, as if Jason had anticipated the conflict and positioned himself to strike first. Standing in her living room with the paper trembling slightly in her hands, Monica felt the landscape around her alter once again, not through construction this time, but through the recognition that she was entering a terrain of power and law where silence and solitude would offer no defense. The sun might return tomorrow, but it would fall behind walls that were not hers, and she understood in that moment that the view she had cherished was no longer just scenery. It was contested ground. Monica tried at first to dismiss the letter as a mistake, a piece of legal posturing that would dissolve once she clarified the obvious. Yet something in the tone of the words unsettled her, a confidence that implied not a tentative complaint, but a carefully prepared strike. And as the days passed, she discovered this was not an idle threat but the opening of a campaign. The courier who had delivered the envelope returned a week later with another document, this time a notice of intent to sue unless she removed what the text referred to as natural obstructions to solar access, an archaic phrase that sounded more like a parody of environmental law than a real statute. Still, Monica carried the paper to her desk and began searching, digging into municipal codes and state ordinances late into the night, only to discover that in fact such provisions did exist, rarely invoked but real nonetheless, remnants of the 1970s solar rights movement when legislators had attempted to protect access to sunlight for panels and gardens. It was bizarre, she thought, that her neighbor would seize upon this nearly forgotten doctrine, and more bizarre still that the law firm representing him had managed to weave it into a plausible argument against her century-old trees. When she looked at the date printed at the top of the first letter, she felt the strangeness sharpen into something more sinister. The claim had been drafted weeks before the final section of Jason's mansion was complete, meaning he had anticipated the so-called obstruction before he ever stood on his terrace, and rather than consult or negotiate, he had prepared his assault in advance, as though the conflict were not an accident of architecture, but part of his design from the beginning. That realization darkened her view of him far more than the physical shadow his house cast, because it revealed intent. And intent meant this would not be resolved with apologies or quick compromises. At the college, she tried to conceal her distraction, but lectures that once flowed with ease began to fracture, her voice stumbling as her mind returned to the unfolding problem on the hillside. Students noticed her drifting gaze, her preoccupation, yet she told no one, embarrassed that a matter so mundane as property lines and sunlight could consume her thoughts. Back at home, she caught herself pacing the rooms in the evening, glancing repeatedly at the terrace as if the light might somehow return, then turning toward the legal papers spread across the dining table, each line of dense text another reminder that she was no longer living in quiet isolation, but in a zone of contestation mapped by lawyers and surveyors. Jason, meanwhile, remained unseen, a presence that asserted itself not through words or gestures, but through the looming geometry of his house and the ceaseless arrival of mail bearing his lawyer's seal. Monica wondered if he was even living there yet. Lights came on at irregular hours, sometimes the hum of machinery carried across the slope at night, but she never encountered him in person. The distance was calculated, she suspected, because his strategy was not to argue directly but to let the machinery of law grind her down, to make her feel invisible in her own space. When a third letter arrived, this one a formal notice of court filing with her name listed as defendant, the absurdity of it collapsed into dread. She sat on the terrace staring at the folded paper for nearly an hour, the sunset bleeding behind the wall of glass across the fence before she finally opened it. The language was cold, clinical, enumerating her alleged violations and the damages sought. Removal of the trees, payment of fees, and acknowledgement of his solar rights. The suit itself was outrageous, yet what unnerved her more was the precision with which it had been structured, every paragraph citing precedents from counties she had never heard of, obscure rulings dredged from decades past. Someone had invested time and resources not merely to inconvenience her, but to entangle her in a web from which escape would be neither simple nor swift. She thought of ignoring it, of tossing the envelope into the fire, but then remembered the warnings on the university's faculty training about legal obligations. A failure to respond would mean default. Judgment automatically entered against her. Trees cut down under order, perhaps even liens placed on the house she had only just begun to call her own. The thought made her stomach tighten. She resolved to seek advice, though not from colleagues. She could not bear to expose her vulnerability in the academic circle where appearances of control mattered. Instead, she drove into town and stepped into the county library, a place where she had spent childhood summers and where the smell of dust and old wood steadied her. She asked the reference librarian if there were archives of property disputes, and after some hesitation the woman led her to a basement room filled with boxes. There, among brittle maps and folded ordinances, Monica found confirmation of her suspicion. The doctrine Jason invoked had almost never been applied in their county, and in every case it had concerned commercial installations of solar panels. Never a private dispute over views. Yet, as she copied the pages, she also discovered that Jason's attorneys had filed motions not only in the civil court, but also with the Planning Commission, requesting a review of her property for non-compliance with environmental standards. It was a second front, and it threatened to draw other agencies into the fight. When she returned home that night, she noticed something odd near the border of her land. New stakes had been hammered into the soil, painted bright orange as if surveying work had been done in her absence. She crouched beside one and read the numbers etched onto its surface, recognizing enough from her library research to understand this was not a random act but part of an official boundary assessment. Jason had not only filed suit, but already initiated a process that could shift the physical lines between their lots. The realization sent a chill through her, because it meant he was not waiting for judgment. He was acting as though victory were inevitable. Inside the house, she spread the documents across the floor, piecing together the timeline. Letters dated before the mansion was complete, stakes driven into the earth without her consent, parallel filings in multiple offices. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not the clumsy aggression of a difficult neighbor, but a coordinated strategy to push her into concession. She tried to sleep, but could not, lying awake while the shadows of the mansion fell across her ceiling through the window, and with each passing hour the certainty grew that she had stumbled into something larger than a quarrel over trees. It was about territory, precedent, the demonstration of power by someone who built houses as symbols of conquest, and she, with her inherited cottage and solitary habits, had become the obstacle he intended to erase. By dawn, she knew she would have to fight, not because she sought conflict, but because retreat would mean erasure, the quiet obliteration of her claim to the place that had carried her aunt's memory and given her a fragile sense of permanence. She gathered the papers, bound them with string, and whispered aloud as if to steady herself, "If this is the opening, then I will not let it become the ending." The sun rose, muted behind the gleaming wall of Jason's house, and for the first time, she felt the loss not as a slow ache but as a summons. The first hearing was scheduled with unsettling speed, as though the court calendar had bent itself to Jason's will, and Monica walked into the municipal building with the unfamiliar sensation of being both invisible and exposed at once, carrying her. Folder of documents like a shield she knew was already too thin. The courtroom was nearly empty, only a scattering of clerks and a bailiff leaning against the wall, but Jason was there, seated with two attorneys beside him, their briefcases polished and their expressions neutral, men who carried the calm of professionals who had done this many times before. He did not look at her when she entered, but she felt the weight of his presence, an aura of certainty that seemed to radiate from the way he rested one hand casually on the table, as though the outcome had already been decided. The judge, a woman with tired eyes and the deliberate tone of someone who had long ceased to be surprised by disputes over fences and rights of way, began the session by acknowledging the peculiarity of the claim, yet allowed Jason's attorney to speak at length, weaving a narrative in which Monica's property appeared as the aggressor, her trees framed as deliberate obstructions designed to deny his client the enjoyment of his lawful space. Listening to the words, Monica felt a strange dissociation, as if they were speaking about someone else entirely, and yet each sentence bound her more tightly into the net of accusation. When her turn came, she spoke too quickly, stumbling over the citations she had copied from the library, her voice betraying the tremor in her chest. The judge did not chastise her, but her silence afterward carried the same effect, a pause that suggested weakness. What saved her from immediate defeat was not her argument, but the lack of precedent. The judge noted that such cases were rare and required careful examination, postponing judgment until further evidence could be gathered. Yet even this small reprieve felt hollow, because Jason's attorneys had already introduced requests for a site visit, implying that inspectors would soon be walking her land, measuring not only trees but perhaps walls, fences, even the house itself. As she left the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Jason finally turning his head toward her, his expression not hostile but faintly amused, as if he had anticipated every word she had spoken and found her efforts both predictable and inadequate. Days later, the inspectors arrived, not announced but simply appearing at the foot of her slope with clipboards, knocking perfunctorily before proceeding to circle the property. Monica followed them, protesting quietly, but they assured her that their presence was authorized, the paperwork filed through Jason's petition. They measured the height of the trees, photographed the shadows across the grass, and even placed temporary markers along the border. One of them muttered something about inconsistencies in the recorded coordinates, and the phrase struck her like a warning bell, though they refused to elaborate. By the time they left, her garden looked as though it had been invaded by a survey expedition, fluorescent flags fluttering like wounds in the soil. That evening, unable to bear the silence of the house, Monica drove aimlessly until she reached the outskirts of town where the landscape flattened into fields. There she parked and sat with her head against the steering wheel, breathing the scent of cut hay and gasoline. She realized with dread that Jason's strategy was not to win quickly but to grind her down, to make the process so exhausting, so expensive, that she would capitulate out of desperation. His lawyers could summon inspectors at will, their fees absorbed by his fortune, while she had only her modest salary and the stubbornness that had carried her through academic battles, but offered little defense in the realm of property law. The escalation became visible in smaller, subtler ways as well. A week later, she returned home from campus to find construction vehicles idling just beyond the border, workers unloading materials for what they described as a pergola, though the skeletal frame already towered in a way that suggested something far more permanent. When she questioned them, they shrugged, pointing to permits signed by Jason's wife, and though the documents looked authentic, she recognized the tactic, another addition disguised as temporary, positioned to further solidify their claim to the space. The sound of drilling filled the evenings, a mechanical roar that drowned the quiet she had once cherished, and each strike of the hammer felt like punctuation on a sentence written to erase her. Her attempts to seek assistance from city officials yielded only frustration. The planning office, when she requested clarification about the boundary stakes, told her to file a formal inquiry, which would take months to process. The environmental agency, when she protested the demand to cut her trees, replied with a neutral acknowledgement that the matter was under review. Each conversation ended with polite deflection, leaving her more aware of how isolated she was. The system was not malicious, but indifferent, a machine that moved slowly unless pressed by wealth and influence, and Jason had both. The psychological weight grew heavier. At night, Monica began to dream of walls closing in, of windows turning opaque, of landscapes swallowed by structures that multiplied like an infection. She would wake drenched in sweat, the glow of the mansion's exterior lights cutting through her curtains like a reminder that even in darkness his presence dominated. She tried to anchor herself in routine, grading papers, preparing lectures, but the rhythm of her days fractured around the constant intrusion of legal notices, survey flags, and the looming threat of financial ruin. Then came the moment that transformed her unease into a sharpened resolve. Sorting through the documents delivered by the inspectors, she noticed a discrepancy in the coordinates they had logged, numbers that did not align with the official plate she had copied from the archives. She cross-referenced them late into the night, tracing lines on maps, and realized that the adjusted boundary placed nearly 3 feet of Jason's construction on her side of the property. It was a detail the inspectors had either overlooked or deliberately ignored, but once she saw it, she could not unsee it. His mansion did not merely cast a shadow over her view, it physically intruded upon her land. The discovery filled her with both fear and a surge of determination, because it meant she was not merely defending trees or sunsets, but reclaiming something tangible, something measurable in feet and inches. It gave her a weapon, though she knew it would also escalate the war. Folding the papers, she whispered to herself that she would no longer stumble in court, no longer pace helplessly behind inspectors, because now the ground itself testified in her favor. And yet, as she looked out at the dark silhouette of Jason's house towering above her, she also understood that revealing this truth would provoke a counterstrike, one that might strip away the remnants of her fragile peace. The first escalation had begun, not with violence, but with the slow tightening of legal cords around her. Yet she sensed the struggle would only deepen, each step drawing her further into a conflict where silence offered no refuge, and retreat meant erasure. The night after discovering the discrepancy in the survey records, Monica could not sleep, and instead she sat at her desk with both maps laid out. The original plat copied from the county archive and the adjusted coordinates taken from the inspector's report, tracing and retracing the lines with the careful concentration of someone who knows that in those numbers lies either salvation or defeat. The difference was small, just a few feet, but in property law, even inches could alter ownership. And here those feet meant that Jason's house, his gleaming wall of glass and steel, intruded directly into her land. At dawn, when the first gray light filtered through the branches outside, she made the decision to take the documents to someone who could confirm her suspicions with authority rather than intuition. The county records office was a squat building with faded walls that smelled of dust and ink, and the clerk behind the counter at first regarded her with the weary patience of someone accustomed to residents complaining about fences and hedges. But as Monica unfolded the documents and pointed out the inconsistencies, the clerk's expression shifted from mild irritation to cautious interest. He excused himself, disappeared into the back room, and after a long wait returned with a thin folder containing the original cadastral map from decades ago. When Monica compared the hand-drawn boundaries with the digital printouts, her suspicion solidified into certainty. The line had been incorrectly transcribed during a recent update of the digital system, a clerical error that had gone unnoticed, until now, but one with enormous consequences. The clerk, speaking in a lowered voice, admitted that mistakes sometimes occurred during the mass digitization process, but rarely did they result in such a blatant overlap of structures. He could not offer her immediate remedy, only the assurance that the error could be investigated if she filed a formal petition. Monica thanked him, her hands trembling as she gathered the papers, aware that she now possessed something both powerful and dangerous, a truth that could unravel Jason's position, but also provoke a retaliation of greater intensity. She contacted a lawyer, not one of the glossy firms downtown, but a modest office recommended by a colleague who had once dealt with a zoning issue. The attorney, a woman named Raina Moore, listened attentively as Monica explained, and after examining the documents she leaned back with a slow nod, confirming that the discovery could indeed shift the entire case. Raina explained that if Jason's mansion encroached on Monica's property, even by a foot, it constituted trespass and could invalidate his claims entirely. Yet she also warned that such a revelation would not end the matter quickly. Jason would fight with every resource, and the courts would be reluctant to order demolition of a structure already standing, preferring instead to push for settlements or easements. The path ahead, she said, would be long, expensive, and psychologically exhausting. Monica nodded, fully aware that exhaustion had already become part of her daily existence. Raina proposed a strategy. They would file a counterclaim, not only contesting Jason's lawsuit but asserting Monica's ownership of the disputed strip of land, demanding recognition of the encroachment. This would shift Monica from the defensive posture she had been forced into, making her the plaintiff in her own right. For the first time since the ordeal began, Monica felt a flicker of strength, as though she were no longer merely shielding herself from blows but preparing to strike back. In the days that followed, Monica and Raina worked together, compiling evidence with a precision that mirrored Jason's own tactics. They photographed the boundary markers, measured the distances from the foundation to the flagged line, and requested affidavits from neighbors who remembered the original placement of fences decades earlier. It was tedious, draining work, yet Monica found herself sustained by the sense that she was no longer wandering in confusion, but moving along a deliberate path. Still, the tension of waiting gnawed at her. Each evening she returned home to the looming silhouette of Jason's mansion, its glass reflecting the dying light, and she wondered whether he already knew what she had discovered, whether he was preparing his own counterstroke. Her answer came sooner than expected. One morning she found an envelope in her mailbox bearing the seal of Jason's law firm. Inside was a letter accusing her of harassment for unauthorized tampering with boundary markers and threatening additional legal action if she continued her interference. Monica read the words with a mixture of fury and dread, recognizing in them Jason's uncanny ability to invert reality, to transform her defense into an accusation. When she showed the letter to Raina, the lawyer only smiled grimly and said it was a predictable maneuver, an attempt to intimidate her into retreat. Raina reassured her that as long as they documented everything, such accusations would collapse under scrutiny. Yet intimidation did not come only through letters. Monica began to notice unfamiliar vehicles idling near the base of the hill, engines running as though waiting, their occupants watching her property before driving off. Once, returning home late, she found her gate left ajar, though she was certain she had locked it. Another time she discovered faint spray paint markings on the asphalt near her driveway, cryptic symbols that she guessed were related to surveying but which carried the unsettling aura of intrusion. She reported these incidents to Raina, who advised her to remain calm, to record everything, to resist the temptation to react impulsively. Monica tried, but the cumulative effect was corrosive. She felt her solitude eroding, her sanctuary turning into a stage for constant surveillance and pressure. Still, the counterclaim moved forward, and when they submitted it to the court, Jason's composure cracked ever so slightly. At the next hearing, he appeared with his usual calm, but Monica noticed the stiffness in his jaw, the way his lawyers conferred more urgently than before. The judge listened carefully as Raina presented the evidence of encroachment, her voice steady, her citations sharp, and for the first time Monica saw the judge's eyes flicker with genuine interest rather than weary detachment. The proceedings were postponed once more, pending a full survey ordered by the court, but Monica left the building with the knowledge that the ground beneath Jason's mansion was no longer secure. It was this shift, the transformation of her role from hunted to hunter, that marked the true midpoint of the struggle. She was no longer simply reacting to Jason's maneuvers but forcing him into a position of defense. Yet victory did not bring relief. Instead, it deepened the stakes. For now, the battle was not about whether her trees would fall, but whether his house itself was built on stolen soil. The enormity of that possibility weighed heavily on her, and as she stood once more on her terrace watching the sun vanish behind the glass wall, she realized that the conflict had ceased to be about sunsets and had become a war over the very definition of boundaries, both physical and personal. That night she walked through the rooms of her house, touching the walls as though to remind herself that they still belonged to her, whispering the names of her aunt who had left the property to her, promising that she would not surrender it. The fight ahead would be harder, Jason's resources greater, the tactics dirtier. But she understood now that retreat was impossible. The midpoint had come, and it had split her life into before and after. From this point on, she would no longer be merely the custodian of a view. She would be the defender of ground, of memory, of the fragile yet unyielding claim to a place that was hers. The weeks that followed the judge's order for a new survey transformed Monica's life into a rhythm of constant anticipation, each day carrying the possibility of revelations that might either strengthen her position or collapse it entirely. And during this suspended time, Jason seemed to abandon any pretense of subtlety. Where once his mansion had loomed in silence, now it became the center of activity, contractors arriving in unmarked vans, workers carrying blueprints and materials, their presence suggesting that he was preparing for contingencies. She would watch from her terrace as men in fluorescent vests paced along the border with tripods and measuring tapes, their eyes avoiding hers, their gestures rehearsed, and though she could not hear their words, she felt the deliberate intent of their movements, as if they were redrawing her world line by line. When the official surveyors arrived, dispatched under court order, she experienced a strange duality. Relief that impartial eyes would confirm the encroachment and dread that those eyes might instead find technicalities that erased her claim. They spent hours on the land, placing electronic sensors, muttering coordinates into handheld devices, the hum of their instruments filling the quiet spaces once reserved for birdsong. Jason emerged briefly to confer with them, his expression calm but sharp, while Monica stood at her porch, uninvited yet unwilling to withdraw, her presence a silent reminder that she was not absent from the battle being fought over her soil. The survey results, delivered weeks later, confirmed what she had suspected. The digital records contained errors, and the physical boundaries placed the mansion's western wing several feet into her property. Yet even this apparent victory carried no sense of finality, because Jason's lawyers immediately filed motions contesting the survey's methodology, demanding alternative assessments, and in the meantime they launched a barrage of counterclaims, designed to bury Monica in procedural demands. She received notices accusing her of maintaining unsafe vegetation, of neglecting erosion controls, even of violating noise ordinances because of the occasional gatherings of students who came to discuss philosophy with her on the terrace. Each accusation was spurious, yet each required response, and soon her evenings dissolved into the endless drafting of replies with Raina, who warned her that the strategy was clear: overwhelm her with simultaneous battles so that fatigue would do the work of defeat. The pressure extended beyond the courtroom. Monica noticed that her mailbox began to fill with unsolicited advertisements for property management companies, glossy pamphlets depicting smiling agents eager to relieve homeowners of burdensome responsibilities. One afternoon, she received a phone call from a number she did not recognize, and the voice on the other end, smooth and practiced, offered to purchase her property at a generous price, considering the complications you've been experiencing. When she refused and hung up, the silence that followed felt heavier than the words, a silence that suggested observation, as though someone were monitoring not only her land but her resilience. Her sense of isolation deepened when she learned that Jason had begun cultivating alliances among the neighbors. Families who had once waved politely now avoided her gaze, and one evening at the grocery store she overheard fragments of conversation, Jason's name spoken with sympathy, her own with derision, as if she had become the antagonist in a story he was carefully narrating to the community. The realization stung, not because she had expected friendship from those around her, but because she understood how narratives shaped perception, and how quickly the truth could be buried beneath the repetition of a convenient lie. In response, Monica turned inward, strengthening her alliance with Reyna and building a meticulous archive of every incident. She installed discreet cameras at the edges of her property, not to broadcast her struggle but to gather undeniable records should Jason's provocations escalate further. She began keeping a journal, writing each night not only the legal details but her impressions, her fears, her observations of the subtle encroachments that could otherwise be dismissed as paranoia. The act of writing steadied her, transforming chaos into narrative, giving her the sense that she was authoring her resistance rather than merely enduring it. But Jason escalated again, not with letters or construction but with a calculated move that struck at the foundation of her security. One morning she found a notice pinned to her gate, issued by the county tax assessor's office, announcing a reassessment of her property value due to proximity to disputed boundaries. The reassessment dramatically increased the taxable value of her land, raising her annual burden to a level she could scarcely afford. It was a maneuver too precise to be coincidence, and when Reyna examined it, she confirmed Monica's suspicion. Jason's attorneys had submitted documentation portraying her land as a prime candidate for development, thereby triggering the reassessment. The strategy was brutal in its simplicity. If he could not remove her through law, he would force her out through financial suffocation. The weight of this discovery left her shaken, but it also sharpened her resolve. Standing on the terrace that evening, watching the sun fracture against the glass wall of Jason's house, she realized that every escalation had pushed her further from retreat and closer to defiance. The battle was no longer about a view or even a strip of land. It had become a test of endurance, a struggle to assert that her presence could not be erased by money, manipulation, or legal attrition. She knew Jason would not relent, that his resources allowed him to prolong the conflict indefinitely, but she also sensed that he had underestimated something intangible, something beyond wealth or influence, the capacity of a single individual to resist erasure when the ground beneath her feet carried not only legal title but memory, inheritance, and identity. With that recognition, she closed her journal, filed away the day's notices, and whispered into the deepening twilight that she would endure whatever came next. The second escalation had not broken her. It had clarified the battlefield. What remained was to prepare for the inevitable climax, the moment when truth and persistence would collide with Jason's empire of glass and paperwork, and only one would remain standing on the disputed ground. The day of the decisive hearing arrived with the weight of inevitability, and Monica walked into the courthouse carrying not only the folders Reyna had meticulously prepared, but also the silent burden of months spent under siege, a heaviness that pressed on her chest even as she forced herself to keep her pace steady. The courtroom was more crowded this time, not with spectators but with the quiet machinery of a case that had grown too large to be dismissed as a private quarrel. Clerks wheeling in boxes of documents, surveyors seated in the back row prepared to testify, and Jason himself positioned at the plaintiff's table flanked by 3 attorneys, his expression still calm but edged with the faint tension of someone who knows the ground beneath him is no longer stable. The proceedings began with Jason's lawyers speaking in long, rehearsed cadences, reciting once again the litany of claims about obstructed sunlight, diminished property value, and Monica's alleged negligence, their voices droning like an incantation, intended to dull resistance. Yet, as Reyna rose to speak, the rhythm of the room shifted. She began not with technicalities, but with the story of the land itself, reminding the court that Monica's property had existed in its current form for generations, that the trees, now labeled as obstructions, had been planted long before Jason had purchased his lot, that her client had not altered the landscape but inherited it. Then, with measured precision, she unfolded the maps, the original plats, and the court-ordered survey, aligning them side by side until the intrusion could be seen with the naked eye. Jason's mansion, bold and gleaming, standing several feet across. The legal boundary, its foundation embedded in soil that did not belong to him. The moment was quiet yet electric, the kind of silence that falls when denial collides with irrefutable evidence. Jason's attorneys attempted to object, questioning methodology, implying bias, but the judge cut through their words, asking the surveyor himself to step forward and confirm. He did so with professional detachment, explaining the discrepancy, tracing with a pointer the line that divided rightful property from encroachment. His conclusion was unequivocal. The structure violated the boundary. Jason finally spoke then, his voice smooth but tinged with strain, arguing that the error was not his fault but a clerical mistake by the county, that he had built in good faith relying on official records, and that to punish him for such an error would be unjust. It was an argument designed to shift responsibility away from himself, and for a moment Monica feared the court might accept it, might decide that tearing down a portion of a mansion was too extreme, that compromise must be found. But Reyna seized the moment, reminding the judge that Jason had filed his original complaint before the mansion was even complete, that he had anticipated conflict and prepared legal weapons in advance, evidence that he had not merely relied on mistaken records but had manipulated them to his advantage. She read aloud from the first letter, dated weeks before construction finished, and as her voice echoed in the chamber, Monica felt the truth settle like a stone. This was not the story of an innocent homeowner caught in bureaucracy, but of a calculated developer attempting to erase a neighbor through preemption and pressure. The judge's ruling did not come instantly. She recessed the court for an hour, leaving Monica to sit in the hallway with her hands clenched around the edge of a bench, watching Jason pace at the far end while his lawyers murmured around him. When the court reconvened, the air felt sharper, as though everyone sensed the finality approaching. The judge spoke firmly, her words deliberate, acknowledging the unusual nature of the case but affirming that the law was clear. Property boundaries must be respected, and encroachment could not be excused by convenience or influence. She declared Jason's original complaint invalid, dismissed all claims against Monica, and further ordered that the section of the mansion extending into her land must be either removed or subject to a transfer of ownership at a value determined by Monica, not Jason. Additionally, Jason was required to compensate her for legal expenses and damages incurred through months of harassment. The words struck Monica like a release of breath she had been holding for an entire year, yet there was no surge of triumph, only an exhausted clarity. Jason sat rigid, his jaw locked, the facade of calm finally cracking into a mask of restrained fury. But he said nothing, perhaps recognizing that further protest would only expose him more. As the gavel fell, the sound reverberating through the chamber, Monica realized that the war of attrition had ended, that her silence, her endurance, her refusal to vanish had brought her to this moment of recognition. Walking out of the courthouse, she did not look back at Jason or his lawyers, choosing instead to step into the pale sunlight with the knowledge that her land remained hers, that the view of the horizon, though scarred, had not been surrendered. The climax had not been loud or dramatic, but in its quiet firmness it carried the weight of finality, and for Monica that was enough. In the weeks after the ruling, life on the hillside slowly shifted from the fever of conflict to the strange quiet of aftermath, and Monica found herself walking through her house as though reacquainting herself with a space that had been occupied, not by intruders, but by fear. The rooms suddenly lighter now that the constant weight of summons and notices no longer pressed against the walls. The survey flags were removed, the inspectors gone, and for the first time in many months she could step onto her terrace without the sense of being observed from across the fence. Jason's mansion remained, looming and unfinished, its western wing draped in tarps where contractors had halted work, and though the sight of it still carried a sting, it also served as proof that he had not triumphed, that the boundary he had tried to erase had instead reasserted itself in stone and soil. Monica did not celebrate in loud ways. There were no parties, no declarations to neighbors who had already chosen their sympathies. but in the evenings she returned to her ritual of watching the sky, now partially restored, the sun sliding once again into the horizon rather than disappearing entirely behind glass. She noticed the subtle colors she had almost forgotten, the gradual turn from orange to violet, and with each sunset she felt her body release a little more of the tension it had carried for so long. The victory was not total. Some of the damage could never be undone. The friendships lost among neighbors, the sleepless nights, the trust in solitude, but it was enough to remind her that resistance had meaning, that endurance was not wasted. Jason remained on the other side, his presence reduced to occasional glimpses of him crossing his terrace or the sound of contractors arriving only to leave again, and Monica realized that whatever further battles he pursued would no longer erase her. Claim, because the court had set the line in ink that could not be redrawn. She tended her garden, replanted flowers near the places where survey stakes had scarred the soil, and told herself that healing was not the absence of scars, but the ability to live with them. The house once again belonged wholly to her, and in its silence she discovered not the fragility of retreat but the strength of having faced and endured.